learned about Quakerism followed a very specific script that left out important details. I learned Quakers were, quote unquote, the first abolitionists. I learned Quakers were and always have been abolitionists and activists for peace. In this moment, I'm going to invite us to reflect upon your earliest memories of learning about Quakers and abolition. What were you taught about Quakers and slavery? Let's take about 5 minutes to write down those memories, and I'll call us back to share when the time is up. So you can grab your pens and paper and have a chance to reflect on this query, and it'll stay up for the duration of our time. Friends, we're going to gather in 30 minutes, or 30 seconds, excuse me. All right, friends, I invite you to share if you feel led. You can either share in the chat box, or if you can't share in the chat box, you can also raise your hand and a member of the staff will call on you. But let's try and use the chat box since it'll be easier for. I'm seeing a message from David Miller saying that all friends said meeting was divided. Some resisted freeing slaves, most did not. Some did not want to join a movement. Some joined or stated local abolition society and built a hall for speakers. Some worked as magistrates that were slavery. Some hid people fleeing from slavery. Oh, and for phone-only participants, I'm not sure what the best way is to call on you here, but TJ might be able to help with that.
You can either use *9 to raise your hand, or you can just unmute yourself and speak.
Mary Beth says, I thought we were the heroes of abolition. Olivia Chuckley mentioned sort of the white savior story of Quakers being the good white people who ran the Underground Railroad. Jonathan mentioned the Germantown Declaration Against Slavery in 1698. Carolyn Peters Eckel discussed first day school learning about John Woolman.
I don't.
In the 60s, as a child, I learned that Friends were the first to free their slaves, were active in the Underground Railroad, and this was in a secular elementary school. And then in the 90s, as an adult, I learned from the Quakers, who were more nuanced, that it was very divisive and took a long time.
Thank you for sharing, friends. Well, I'm really appreciating all the engagement on the chat box. I'm not able to read all of them out loud, but friends are sharing about where and how and when they receive this education, whether in secular schools or friends schools. All right, let's continue. And thank you all so much for sharing. There'll be a couple other moments today when we'll have similar reflections. So it's not time to contribute. So in reality, as many of the friends shared on the chat box, Quakers were not the first abolitionists. Declaring that the Society of Friends unanimously and eternally stood against slavery doesn't really do justice to the fact that the first abolitionists were indeed enslaved African people. Many Quakers supported these first abolitionists, but it would take many years for white friends to formally stand against slavery. And up until that point, and even after, many white Quakers refused abolition and participated in the slave trade. So I want to take us back in history for a few moments, and you can follow along on the slideshow. On this slide, I'm going to give an image description. There's a painting on the right-hand side. In Dutch, it describes English Quakers and tobacco planters in Barbados. And we have two people who are in farming attire, showcasing that description. So in the 17th century world, white English Quakers commonly accepted and practiced enslavement of African peoples. Many of the first Quaker immigrants to North America came via Barbados, where Quakers participated in the buying and selling of human beings. After the arrival of Quaker missionaries in the 1650s, Quakerism flourished in Barbados and even gained the name the Nursery of Truth, because it was so filled with friends. All but four of the white Quakers in Barbados were slaveholders at this time. When Pennsylvania was founded in 1682, Friends mobilized their connections to Quaker enslavers in Barbados to purchase African people and amass wealth. When George Fox visited Barbados in 1671 and witnessed the Quakers participating in slavery, he did not encourage abolition or anti-slavery activism. Let that sink in for a moment. George Fox witnessed the enslavement, torture, dehumanizing impact of slavery upon enslaved people, and how slavery too altered the enslavers' minds and well-being. In his letter to the governor of Barbados, Fox even promised not to interfere in the institution of slavery. He did, however, encourage Friends to worship with enslaved people, a subversive act because it jeopardized the relationship between white enslavers and Black enslaved people. The justification for slavery at this time was religious difference, so Christianizing enslaved Africans would change their status as property under the eyes of law. Quakers and other Protestant groups came under fire for converting enslaved people and threatening the power dynamics of slavery. As the threat of Christian conversion increased, the first laws using the language of whiteness began to appear. For instance, when enslaved person Charles Cuffey was baptized as Anglican in Barbados, Barbadian lawmakers introduced a law that would redefine citizenship as a freed person to include the word white as well as Christian. The law declared that every white man professing the Christian religion who hath attained to the full age of 21 years and hath 10 acres of freehold shall be deemed a freeholder. Friends of European descent in every yearly meeting in North America benefited in some way from the enslavement of African people. Wealthy Quaker Philadelphian merchants and ship owners from Rhode Island profited exponentially from the practices of human trafficking and wielded power within their Quaker communities. Many of these wealthy Quakers in New England owned slave plantations in the West Indies, where enslaved Africans were brutally, quote unquote, seasoned and tortured in preparation for their arrival to North America. By 1700, white Quakers owned as many as half of all enslaved people in the Commonwealth. Now, theologically, many Quakers accepted slavery without questioning it. While some found the issue perplexing or troubling, most Friends relied on the brutal process of enslavement for acquisition of wealth and of property. Economic interests vied with Quaker ideology, and for many years, Quakers stood by economics before faith. From the 1680s through 1750s, leaders of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting dominated conversations around slavery, discouraging Friends from engaging in emancipation work at the risk of economic danger. In 1676, friend William Edmondson described the situation that enslavement presented a dilemma to Quakers who believed in the sanctity of property rights on the one hand, and in the notion that each person is free to experience his or her own relationship with God on the other. It would take Quakers until the 1780s to become the first white Christian denomination to formally condemn slavery. This conversation, though, took nearly a century. It would take another 20 years for Quakers to practically fulfill the mandate against slavery, and even longer for white Friends to actually allow Black Quakers and non-Quakers to worship in their meeting houses and study in their schools. In recent years, scholarship on Quakers has nuanced our relationship to slavery and altered the notion that Quakers were eternally and unequivocally abolitionist. At the same time, there were certainly Quakers fully committed to abolition, and we can name any of those names today: Lucretia Mott, the Grimke sisters, Levi Coffin, as Friends discussed in our earlier reflection. I want to take a moment to talk about another abolitionist, friend Benjamin Lay, one of the first white Quaker abolitionists and activists in the 18th century. The painting of him on the slide is to the right, and he is standing with a cane and a book, a basket of fruit, a black coat, and gray hat. So on September 19th, 1738, Benjamin Lay walked into a meeting house in Burlington, New Jersey, many of whose members participated in the slave trade. Having smuggled into meeting a sword and an animal bladder filled with red pokeberry juice inside a hollowed-out book, Lay stood to give a message. He denounced Quaker slaveholders, pulled the sword from his cloak, stabbed the book, and declared, "Thus shall God shed the blood of those persons who enslave their fellow creatures." Red juice burst across the faces of weighty friends in that Burlington meeting house. Because of this and other impassioned anti-slavery activism, Lay was written out of the meeting and forced to live in exile from his community. An important point I want to highlight is that Lay was a little person, or dwarf, and lived with kyphosis, a condition of extreme spine curvature. It is quite likely Lay was written off not only because of his abolitionist leanings, but because also his disability made him more vulnerable to ableist assumptions. Other white Quakers had demonstrated in similarly dramatic ways, public nudity or interrupting church services, and were praised as holy fathers of the Quaker faith. Had Lay been a wealthy, able-bodied man, his message may have gone further, but as a disabled activist, he faced even more obstacles. The way Lay behaved in meeting also brings to mind the expectations we set for decorum in our faith communities. Can we imagine today the uproar in meeting if someone had done something as theatrical as Lay? If fake blood had spattered across our plain cream-colored walls? How might our expectations prevent passionate conversations and testimony around abolition and racial justice? We'll come back to this point later on tonight. Examining Quakers' involvement in slavery gives us some insight into how we operate today as a society of friends. George Fox had the opportunity in Barbados and North America to speak out against slavery, even if the language of abolition hadn't quite reached the table. Instead, Fox opted for a more discreet, reformist method. While revolutionary in its own way, without follow-through, Christianizing as emancipation hit a brick wall with the invention of legally approved whiteness. Wealthy white friends in Philadelphia opted for economic safety and prosperity over protecting the humanity of their neighbor. Sanctifying property rights over human dignity, leaders in our Quaker history turned away from the dangers of abolition to the safety of financial security. Even with the slow approval of abolition, white Quakers continued to discriminate against those of African and Caribbean descent. Abolition is not a one-time event. While many white Quakers followed the witness of abolitionists like Benjamin Lay, Lucretia Mott, and the Grimke sisters, the religious society of friends has taken centuries to move on the issue. Surely we can see the remnants of this history play out today in the society of friends, in our families, in our local and state governments. As I think about the history of Quakers and slavery, I wonder what stimulated Quakers to join the abolitionist movement. For some, it was proximity to the practice of slavery. Some white Quakers witnessed the suffering and evils of enslavement, and this personal experience motivated them to action. For others, it may have been in community and conversation that they became aware. Inertia kept many white friends from acting on abolition even after being exposed. The few names we do have of early white Quaker abolitionists are exciting to talk about, and yet these same people were ridiculed and exiled from their communities. In thinking about our present moment, I witness this same pattern play out. In order to commit to justice, we have to become intimate with our feelings. Much, if not all, of abolitionist work is rooted in the struggle against white supremacy. White supremacy dictated the rules of slavery, just as it dictates the rules of the police and prisons in our present system. White supremacy is a behemoth, but it is not faceless. We can talk about white supremacy as actually a culture with rules that we can only fight once we are able to name. We're putting up a slide here of some of the facets of white supremacy culture that have been published and discussed by the activists Kenneth Jones and Tema Okun. These rules, which some friends might be familiar with, are perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, paternalism, either or thinking, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, and the right to comfort. The rule of white supremacy culture I want to talk about most tonight is defensiveness, fear of open conflict, and by extension, fear of anger. We can see these faces of white supremacy show up often in our history. George Fox straying from emancipation, wealthy Philadelphian friends discouraging divisive conversations on slavery, and white North American friends in general valuing comfort over the discomfort of truth. I think we can see this in our present too. As Quakers, we often struggle to express conflict. As a young girl, I remember learning and meeting that conflict and anger were the opposites of peace. And from that, I took away that by being angry, I was violating my principles as a Quaker child. So on that note, I want us to take another time for reflection. I'd like friends to think back on a moment when you were angry in meeting. You can describe the encounter and the feelings that came up for you. That's part one of the reflection. Part two is describe what you would need to feel supported in your anger or in a conflict. And did you feel that support in the moment you described? This is a longer prompt, so it will take about 8 minutes. Oh, and for friends who are asking questions on the chat, there'll be time for a Q&A at the end of this session.
And this is great.
We have a minute left for our reflection, friends. And I wanted to let people know that these reflection times are also good times to take breaks, get water, use the restroom, whatever you need to do to take care of your body.
Naomi, I find it difficult to type, so I'd like to speak my reaction again.
Of course.
My anger was over the issue of how the meeting handled, or rather mishandled, same-gender union. Had the meeting followed normal Quaker practices in its decision-making, I would have been happy to follow it anywhere. But I found that, I guess, under the stress of the divisiveness of the issue, the meeting couldn't do that. And I definitely did not feel supported in what I was feeling.
Thank you for sharing that. Friends, now is the time to share. You don't have to be specific if you want to keep things vague. That is absolutely welcomed. And you can feel free to share if you feel led to in the chat, or unmute yourself and share.
I saw someone else also say this in the chat. I kind of missed the beginning of what the last friend said. Could you maybe just repeat the first part?
My concern was over how the meeting handled the same-gender union issue.
Thank you, friend.
Joan Broadfield expressed that when they expressed anger at meeting, they felt held.
There had been a conflict, but it wasn't just a conflict, it was a transgression, which had a victim at a middle school friends gathering. And the victim was pressured to have a meeting for worship with attention to healing with his transgressor. And our focus on conflict resolution as seeing that of God within everybody and giving both people this room for healing actually re-victimizes a victim. And I was really angry about it. And I just think that victims, and it wasn't myself that was the victim, but a child, I just think that victims wind up feeling not safe or supported because of our peaceable way of resolving conflicts, instead of, giving equal attention to the transgressor and not always enough support to the victim, giving sometimes more than equal attention, giving too much attention to the transgressor and not doing enough for the victim. So that really concerns me, because I think that's also what played out with abolition, if you think about it.
Sarah Palmer shared in the text, one way that I feel supported in anger is having tools to test my own anger and understand its source and think of how to address it.
If y'all will allow me, Anthony Stover has his hand up. Anthony, would you like to speak?
Thank you, TJ. I want to go back to the first query in regards to your first experience and with Quakers, what your thoughts were. And, you know, an abolition. 20 years ago, my daughter went to a Quaker school, and my initial view and value of Quakers was great education. The meeting I attended, which was Germantown Friends meeting, had the treaty on abolitionists and, you know, pretty much the Quaker values. But as I started scratching my head and, you know, attending worship and attending other meetings and not many friends that look like me, I started reading more. And Naomi, I thank you very much for your presentation tonight, because it tells the whole story. It gives you the truth. And, you know, early friends, the majority, there were only a small amount of early friends that were abolitionists, but early friends, the majority of them were very much engaged in the slave trade, and from ownership to selling, et cetera, et cetera. So, and early friends like George Fox, which saw these horrific acts, not to speak against it, but say, you know, allow you to worship with them. And friends like William Penn, who brought slaves over to, you know, in cultivating Pennsylvania. I have a different view when I hear Quaker traditions and early friends. It kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth. So I'm not so much in tune to Quaker traditions, but I instill the Quaker values in regards to simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality. And I think as we all understand what our true roots are, I think it'll add value to us being the true society of friends that we want to be. And again, Naomi, I thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for sharing. Ray Dole shared in the chat that I feel our obsession with peace and forgiveness often does not make room for anger, which I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Could I say something? It's Pat Libby.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I should be discussing this at this point. I guess when I became angriest with the meeting was when my granddaughter, who had had gone to Plymouth Meeting Friends, came to Germantown Friends for her junior high years, and then was looking at senior high, and the tuition was so horribly high there. I was a member there at Germantown Meeting. My daughter, her mother, had been a lifer. She graduated from GFS. And at the point when my granddaughter was applying then to the high school, they didn't really have enough money to pay the horrible tuition. So they were pleading with the school, because my daughter was a lifer, to get reduced tuition. And she had mentioned this to me, and I remember calling the school and saying, well, she has to talk to us. And then she had called them back, talked to them, got so angry about the fact that they wouldn't help, that they just picked up and moved to the suburbs so that my granddaughter could go to a free high school. But I hear that may be a present problem now with the Black population around Germantown Friends School, and the cost at GFS is just horrendous. And how are they going to deal with that and make it possible for those kids to come?
Thank you, Pat. That's a great point of remembering that so often our anger touches on and intersects with so many issues of justice, whether it's economic or racial or combined. And that I wanted to keep moving with the presentation tonight. It's a great segue. TJ will pull up the slide here in a moment. TJ, could you put it into full screen? Thank you. So here on the slide is part one of a quotation I wanted to share from a Quaker scholar named Jack Giesking, who writes about anger and the necessity for Quakers to express aggression as part of their spiritual path. This is a part of their thesis I want us to listen to, and you can follow along in the slides. So Jack writes, "To be present, to stand the tension of love and hate, to be real, this all takes aggression. This aggression in Quakerism comes out in meeting, in prayer, in love, in hate, in life. We must learn to welcome the dependence upon one another and God that this integration creates and allow it to become shared interdependence, regardless of the healthy channel we choose." And on the next slide, where Quakerism has repressed and projected its aggression can be healed. The passivity confused with pacifism can be overridden. We can be made whole again and prevent our disintegration by our own will, our own aggression. We must withstand the tension of our love and hate, our fear and anger, and survive. And we can do it together. We must be the tiger we were created to be, for we shall never overcome the tiger within us. We can only allow ourselves to be who we are and reside in the ecstasy granted by God. White supremacy culture teaches us to hide or mask or project aggression and anger, to keep conflict stifled and hidden under the table. Now, when I say aggression is important, I'm not advocating for the kind of aggression used to manipulate, harm, and oppress people. No, aggression is a necessary part of being human. It is distinct from violence and hatred, although it may overlap at times. Aggression is the manner in which we express our anger if our boundaries are violated, or if we see another's boundaries violated. To leave aggression behind is tempting, but ultimately means cutting off a part of ourselves intrinsic to the divine. Now, many white liberal leading Christianities struggle with the expression of aggression and anger. There's a tendency to want to see ourselves as only rational, simple, and decent, to bypass the darkness and wildness among us and within us. This kind of theology limits us because it does not allow anger or hurt to be expressed. Quaker worship reflects the culture in which it has stewed. A beloved elder once told me that Quakerism is like tofu. It soaks up the taste of whatever it marinates in. As friends, we have marinated in white supremacy for centuries. In the United States, Quakerism found traction among middle and upper middle class white people, which definitely influences our understanding of ourselves, including our emotions and understanding of the divine. From marinating in the culture of white supremacy, many white American Quakers develop unwritten rules about proper behavior in our communities. For instance, there might be expectations that one should speak in full sentences, using standard English, keeping your body still and your voice calm in meeting. We might emphasize the cerebral and the peaceful, and discourage expressions of frustration, anger, and conflict that are part of being alive. And when we limit behavior in this way, we also limit the expression of the spirit. So, What does anger have to do with abolition and Quaker history? And why am I talking about it tonight? Disconnecting from our anger means disconnecting from our awareness of systematic oppression. It is nearly impossible to bravely witness the suffering and oppression of this moment without being brought to rage. Anger is an energy. It is a gift. It is a tool and a process by which we learn what matters to us. Connecting to this anger means connecting to a profound network of love. We become angry when we witness the suffering of another. We become angry when we are made to suffer. And sometimes we're angry for no reason, but this too is a lesson. Being angry means we cannot be spiritually still. Anger stirs us to action and reconnects us to our core. In order to fully commit to abolitionist work as a faith community, we will need to engage in anger, conflict, and aggression. There is no way to be both anti-racist and fully conflict avoidant. Anti-racism work and abolition require an investment in our relationships unlike any other. And this investment will require honesty and will generate tension. Many, perhaps most of us, have been taught that anger and conflict are antithetical to our morals as friends. I think we have a lot of relearning to do. But just as we've learned white supremacy culture, we can also unlearn it. We can recognize the culture we've marinated in, the expectations we have for what happens in meeting and what's appropriate, and get creative to resist and change the narrative. Being angry doesn't mean departing from our Quakerism, but living more fully, leaning more fully into the call for a just world. Getting angry doesn't mean random violence, but acknowledging the sacredness of anger as a tool and finding ways to express our innate aggression that honors the ecstasy granted by God, as Geese King writes. The title of this presentation, the keynote tonight, is called The Fire of the Light. And as I was thinking about an image that inspires me in abolitionist work, I kept returning to the image of the light, very popular among Quakers, obviously. So this is another reflection time that we'll have together. And I want us to take a moment to reflect upon the image of the light. Think back to your first introduction to Quakerism, whether it was as a child or as an adult or elder. And how was the light described to you? If you're able, I invite you to draw a picture of the light. We'll take 6 minutes for this reflection and come back together to share. Friends, we have a minute left, then we'll come back together. All right, friends, let's gather. I invite you to use the chat function to share any reflections you have. If you've drawn a picture and want to hold it up to the video camera so we can see, just give us a heads up so we can find you. Folks checking out the light is love, like the iris of an eye, image of a candle.
Light rays emanating.
Emanating is what I heard. Friend David shared about the power and the love of radiation in and out of the heart, says Susan. A heart within, says Sarah. The room filling with spirit in the air, says Meg. Barbara says light rays emanating from the heart. Sandy says from Methodist childhood, Jesus wants me for a sunbeam to shine for him each day. The light is illuminating. The light is a sunset. Like heat filling the whole sky, only lasting. Heat lightning filling the whole sky. It's beautiful. Would any friends on phone like to share? Okay. Jeff shared growing up thinking of it any particle inside, but now thinking that it's our whole selves. Oh, Wanda says they're holding a pick up so we can see. Thank you, Wanda. A psychic force field, says Charlie. That of God, says Carter. Wonderful. I really appreciate all these metaphors and images that we're drawing on. A candle. Wonderful. So friends can keep thinking on this as we continue tonight. Inner light is...
share a few comments with you. George Rubin, Method Meeting. The first time I walked into a Quaker meeting was a pastoral meeting in Brooklyn, New York. Dark wood, stained glass windows, a lectern, an organ, and the inner light was in those friends I met. It was unbelievable. They projected a way of spiritual life that has been with me all these years.
Thank you so much for sharing, friend. So with that, I'm going to keep us moving here tonight, but I invite friends to continue to reflect on the inner light as we dive a little deeper. So this inner light that we've talked about goes by many names. The inward light, the seed, the light of Christ. Early friends got the expression from the first chapter of John, where we find in verse 9, the true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. For early friends, this was no metaphor, but the real presence of Christ within. The light signifying more than a singular flame or cozy fire, and for many friends, it served as a beacon the light shone upon injustices. It taught, directed, clarified, and emboldened friends, revealing profound and distressing truths about ourselves. For much of my life, like others have shared, I've envisioned the light as a candle, something quiet, steady, inward focused, and comforting even. And this is only one aspect of the light. Tonight, though, I want to invite us into the image of a more ferocious light, a mama bear type of light. Not small or quavering, but bright and crackling with plenty of firewood. Now, the language of white light can often be a sneaky way, I think, that white supremacy shows up in our language by associating lightness with goodness and darkness with evil. But our light is not a white light. It contains multitudes of colors, and it contains darkness and shadows too. We kindle this light in our communities. Each person brings with them fuel for the fire, whether virtual or in person. And though we each have our own private, glorious connection to such light, in community, I like to think it becomes a fire. In community, in revolution, in gatherings, we unite in a fiery embrace of love and justice. And this, to me, is what it means to be known as people of Quaker faith. In his 1852 speech on July 4th, Frederick Douglass declared, "For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and humanity must be proclaimed and denounced." Now, Frederick Douglass wasn't speaking to a specifically Quaker audience, but we can use this language to rethink our understanding of the light and come at it from a different angle. What if our light did this? What if our understanding of the inner light prompted us to action? What if the light illuminated and fed our righteous anger, our communal sorrow, our profound love and care for one another? What if we understood anger as a force to be channeled, as an expression of how deeply we care? What if we blessed the rage as tenderly as we blessed the peace? The abolitionist work at hand calls us into new relationship with aggression, with conflict, and with our understanding of the light. This call is urgent, but it is not new. In fact, in 1967 PYM Minute reads, "One of the principal sources of tension has been reconciling the urgency of the civil rights crisis with the deliberateness of friends' careful searching for the light." As Quakers, can we be deliberate and full of care while responding urgently to an urgent situation? What will we need to release in this journey to better serve the movement for Black and Indigenous liberation? How might our relationship to the fiery light transform the ways we address injustice? Now, I don't have answers for all these questions tonight, but I invite us to sit with them as we move forward.
Can you read that last question? How might, again?
Sure. How might our relationship to the fiery light transform the ways we address injustice? Since their beginnings as bounty hunters for enslaved Africans, the police have abused, terrorized, and killed mainly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. As the call for abolition and of police and prisons grows more urgent in the United States, we have options as a faith community. We can look back on our histories for examples. We can imagine George Fox encouraging worship with enslaved people, but not supporting full-on abolition. And we know how that turned out. We can imagine Benjamin Lay yelling in meeting and calling out Quakers engaged in human trafficking. Perhaps we can even imagine the committee and the minute that wrote Benjamin Lay out. We have a blueprint for this liberation stuff, although the pieces and players look different, very different today than the 18th century. As a predominantly white faith community in the US, we as Quakers must listen to the witness of Black friends. We may have questions or disagreements, but we cannot pretend we do not witness the violence of the police state, a violence we purport to resist through our Quaker testimonies. As Quakers, and I speak to white Quakers tonight in particular, we have had time to reflect on our past. The ways we were complicit, the ways we rebelled, whether we are longtime members of the Society of Friends or newcomers, we participate in and inherit this history. I look at the reaction from George Fox and other Quakers ambivalent or ignorant about abolition, and I recognize my own ambivalence and ignorance. I feel ashamed, but we can work with that shame. Abolitionist work will always be imperfect. As a friend once said, there are two ways of doing anti-racism work, imperfectly or not at all. The inevitable imperfection does not mean we should shut down in frustration, but it also does not give us a free pass for harm-doing. We will need to establish systems of accountability to weather the conflict, anxieties, and shame that will inevitably arise. Each moment of anxiety, though, is an opportunity for growth and opening. In an ideal world, our communities would nurture and hold us accountable through these growing pains. And we can dream toward this ideal world together. In closing for tonight, before we get into the Q&A portion, I want to offer this poem written by John O'Donohue, and I can include the words to the poem in our chat box tonight after I read it. Now the poem is called In Praise of Fire. Let us praise the grace and risk of fire. In the beginning, the word was red, and the sound was thunder, and the wound in the unseen spilled forth the red weather of being. In the name of fire, the flame and the light, praise the pure presence of fire that burns from within without thought of time. The hunger of fire has no need for the reliquary of the future. It adores the eros of now, where the memory of the earth in flames that lick and drink the air is made to release. Its long enduring forms in a powder of ashes, left for the wind to decipher. As air intensifies the hunger of fire, may the thought of death breathe new urgency into our love of life. As fire cleanses dross, may the flame of passion burn away what is false. As short as the time from spark to flame, so brief may the distance be between heart and being. May we discover beneath our fear embers of anger to kindle justice. May courage cause our lives to flame in the name of the fire and the flame and the light. Thank you, friends. We're going to take the next few minutes for questions, reflections, and comments. Feel free to raise hands, either using the raise hand function or physically raising your hand, and one of us will do our best to call on you. Or if we don't see you, go ahead and mute yourself and speak.
Susan, please unmute yourself and speak.
So, thank you for this presentation. It was quite compelling. I wondered if you have ever been called in to coach or to help with valuing the anger part in conflict resolution. How do you do that?
Thank you for asking that, Susan. I wouldn't say I've been a coach for anger, but I might see it that way. And I in some of my chaplaincy work, I work with families and patients and staff, usually with end-of-life care, which often brings up feelings of anger and conflict and aggression, especially among families. So I think those experiences have taught me the importance of listening and sitting still and being as honest as possible, while also nurturing my own boundaries as a caregiver, as a spiritual caregiver. So it's been through the lens of spiritual care that I've had the chance to learn more about anger. And I think in moments where we can create an environment of deep listening and reflective listening are moments when anger can be most fully and healthfully expressed.
Could I ask a follow-up?
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you recommend, this is not really a yes or no question, but would you recommend that meetings practice anger as a kind of spiritual care?
Yeah, I think it's a great practice, and I don't have a necessarily like a set of steps to practice, but I think it will be really amazing to be able to practice in community. And I'm thinking about things like as simple as role plays and being able to work through that as friends, or being able to practice how to listen when somebody is very angry and raising their voice, and being a presence to that and being a witness to that experience, instead of becoming shut off from it. Although I think it does take a lot of care for oneself and having your own care community, especially if it gets overwhelming. I see Claire raising a hand.
Yes. Naomi.
Yes.
Fear, anger is based on feelings, yeah? As Quakers, we're very uncomfortable with feelings. To feel what people of color have been going through for 400 years, to consider, since the Civil War, what we as white people have been inflicting on people of color makes me wild. I am ashamed of myself. I am in disbelief that I feel so miserable about this. And it's a George Fox thing. It's both the ocean of light and the ocean of dark. This is not bad. This is a good fight. But damn it, how can we as Quakers move forward with this issue if we're talking from the head, if we talk about other issues, if we talk about your qualities or what's the next step to do without feeling what it's like to have suffered being a Black person? And my truth is, I am so grateful I was not born Black, because I don't have what it takes to be Black. I don't have that kind of love in me.
Thank you for sharing, Claire. I appreciate. I think you bring up some important issues around our own frustration and anger and shame too. That it's an inevitable process, I think, of learning more about our histories as Quakers and reckoning with how much harm has been done and how deep the harm really goes, and that kind of harm requires us to tap into our own emotional centers in a way that we have not been to do, I think, a way that feels for me very overwhelming and scary. And it's a practice that I'm having to learn. These are muscles that haven't been exercised for many years. And so I think it's going to be a messy process as we re-engage with our emotions. And I think that white supremacy culture really discourages that, because it is a powerful way to engage in activism too. So it's a personal journey, and it's also connected to much larger political and cultural issues. So thank you.
Sue Lynn?
Yes, I am just wondering, I noticed that this is being recorded. Will participants have a way to revisit this talk tonight? Because I would like the chance to take even more notes than I'm able to take.
Yes, it will be. It will be posted later.
How about the chat?
We'll figure that stuff out. Let's make sure to provide as much time as possible for folks to ask questions of Naomi, as we only have her for a limited amount of time, and we'll figure out the logistics after this.
Wanda Weifels?
Well, thanks, Naomi. I wanted to know, towards the end, you mentioned systems of accountability. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, I think that those the systems of accountability that we need will be both found in Quaker community or in faith community and outside in larger systems of care, or even smaller ones, as small as a family or a couple or a relationship, a marriage. I think that the systems of accountability that we'll need especially are things that we can lean on and practice those skills to work through our shame, to figure out how do we connect with our aggression in a way that honors it and also taps into it as an energy and can direct it in a way that feels, I want to say, restorative. Yeah. So it feels a bit vague, to be honest, the systems of accountability, because I don't think we have a lot of blueprints for it. So it's going to require some imagination and dreaming and messing up.
That's why I was hoping you could get us started.
I'll work on it.
Hi, this is Bobby Horowitz. I'm from Germantown Monthly Meeting, and I'm on the phone. Could I get in the queue to have a reflection?
We'll call on you in a few minutes, Bobby.
Thank you so much.
Carter Nash is next. Carter, are you there?
Yeah, I had to unmute. Here is a couple of points. One, I think a lot of Quakers are suffering from, shall we call it, white guilt, and that's where their anger at their ancestors and at themselves goes. I, as a person of color, on the other hand, who am not only have African ancestors, but American indigenous ancestors. I have well, I've often said I could walk around with a chip on my shoulder at being angry at every white person I came across because of the things their ancestors did to my ancestors. But I don't have it within me to do that. I find that it is not productive for me to hold a grudge against someone for something somebody else did. And I have actually had difficulty holding grudges against people who have directly done things to me. I have been physically attacked for being Black. I have been physically attacked for being gay. And I have been able to forgive these people and go on with my life. To carry anger for me is a heavy burden on me. And I have got to be able to live my life with peace within myself. Now, I think there are lots of things about the system that need to be changed, and I will work to change them. I worked in my youth to change them. I was in marches in the 60s and have done what I can now to work toward change. But I cannot do that as effectively if I'm doing it through anger or hate.
Thank you so much for sharing, friend Carter. Yeah, I really appreciate your point about white guilt, and that I think guilt and shame are inevitable consequences of learning about our histories. I think that those are places of opening, but they're not places of ending. So we don't end with guilt and shame. We work through them and walk with them and see what they have to teach us. But feeling guilty as white people is not the end goal or the destination in this process. And I really appreciate, I think friends will always have different experiences of anger, and some will find it not productive or heavy to carry. And one thing that your reflection made me think about was the ways that white supremacy culture punishes and criminalizes anger from people of color. And that the anger that we talk about as a word has so many different reflections in our society of who's allowed to be angry and who's not, and who gets labeled a bad angry person and who's just letting off steam. So I think that those are definitely important things to consider, and I deeply appreciate you sharing with us.
Ellen Deacon.
Thank you for all of this, Naomi. It's such a deep, complicated in many ways process that we're going through to heal all of this. I want to speak briefly to my understanding from my own deep work over decades of looking at what do you have to do to a human being born into the identity that we call white. And it's not a human identity, white. It's an identity created so that racism can be perpetrated. What happens to every one of us to confuse us and earlier on and still turn us into perpetrators of oppression and violence? It's a deep, hard process, and we need to find a way to hold each other as white people. It is certainly not the job of the people we were set up to oppress, to take care of us anymore, as the system was told, tried to tell everybody that's the way it's supposed to work. But we do need to find ways of holding and helping each other grow through this without guilt. It's not our fault. It's our responsibility. It's an imperative. My well-being depends on ending all this oppression, including the ones that come at me as a woman, as an elder, as a disabled person. And I think the element of fear, which we've touched on, is really big here, because I think there's two kinds of anger. I think there's the kind of anger that is real, true, righteous indignation, Benjamin Lay style anger. Frederick, what, say it, please.
Frederick Douglass.
Yes, Frederick Douglass style anger. And then there's the anger that's really terror, but it becomes meanness. And I think we're just going to have to get our hands and our minds and our bodies and our beings dirty with all of this in some way and hold each other through that. And the growth happens. I've seen it. I know it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
The change happens.
Thank you for sharing that, Ellen. I appreciate that. Yeah, the belief and the knowing that this is possible. This is not an impossible ask for us to become more attuned to our aggression, our anger, or to be able to weather the anxieties of shame, guilt, conflict. But it will take practice.
And connection.
And connection.
Yelena?
Yelena Forrester, Chester Monthly. Thank you so much, Naomi, for this.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Yes, thank you, Naomi, so much for this. This was really valuable. I'm wondering if you could speak some to the importance of not turning our anger inward toward ourselves. Speaking as someone who almost committed suicide in college because I was so angry at a close relative, and I didn't know what to do with that anger. I didn't know it was okay to feel angry. And obviously I'm fine now, I'm great, but that is still a tendency that I think many of us do have. If we feel angry or guilty or ashamed, turning that inward, and it twists up inside ourselves and makes us unhealthy. I'm wondering if you can speak to the importance of letting it go.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. And thank you for sharing, Yelena. I think it is, like you mentioned, very, I don't want to say easy, but very possible for our anger to turn in on ourselves and to be something that we harm ourselves with. And that can be a way to process it or to experience control or safety of an emotion that can feel really, really unsafe and really, really destructive. Speaking from my own personal experience as someone who still does not feel comfortable with anger, I'm still learning it, that when it arises in me, it does feel huge, like a tidal wave and uncontrollable. And I attach a lot of weight on it. Oh, this is a bad emotion, or this is going to hurt somebody, and best for it to come back inside and hit me instead of hitting somebody else. I think, like we've spoken about a little bit, like systems of accountability and systems of trust in our community can be ways that we can share that anger and have it be held and nurtured instead of having to carry it alone. That a lot of this emotional work will require personal reflection, but I think that it's really, really important that we remember that we are not islands floating around without connections to each other, that we're we're within a larger web, and there are other people who can help us carry and work through these overwhelming feelings. So those are some thoughts. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but that's what came up for me.
Yes, thank you very much.
Bobby Horowitz.
Hi, I'd like to thank you too. It brought up a lot in me. I belong to a tribe that for 3,000 years hasn't had 1 second, to my knowledge, of worry with anger, and starting with getting real mad at God and going from there. So when I came to Quakerism, what I found and what you've made me realize is what Quakerism, or at least what I've experienced, has allowed me to take that anger and that ability to live with it, grow with it, energize it, and not just end there. And for me, it would be an incredible temptation, a real sense of self-righteousness, a real sense of, I've got this, now let's all listen. What it did, but taking the Quaker principles or what was shared with me, is I was able to get more clarity. I was able to get a wider range of options by not stopping with the anger, but really seeing, is this a tool that can actually be helpful? And that meant I had to invite in whoever or whatever I was angry at. I had to form relationship. Couldn't let the anger separate me from someone or something. It really had to kind of make that the way in. It's and it taught me things like the personality. It made me look at other organizations that I belong to who are wonderful do-good organizations and have no problem calling people out, demeaning others, doing all of that, because they really do believe that the end run, that which they believe to be right, justifies the process. And Quakerism said, nice thought, but we've got something else here that we think might have some weight. Not just what you do, but how you do it. And that for me was an incredible blessing. And so thank you very much for helping me see that it doesn't start or stop with anger, that there's something else moving in the room, and that if my anger blocks me from that and blocks me from you, then I will be impotent in ways that are just sinful. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate that. There's so much in what you shared, but what I wanted to reflect on here for a moment is the experience of being angry at God, which you mentioned earlier. And I wanted to share something from my personal experience, or my professional experience as a chaplain, is seeing there's a big difference in how people think about, is it okay to be angry at God or not? And I'll say that, like, in general, many of the Protestant patients that I work with think it is not okay to be angry at God. And folks from other faith traditions, and Catholic as well, I'm not saying everybody, but there's a tendency to have more spaciousness around anger for God. And somebody, it might have been Yelena, had mentioned the Psalms earlier in our chat tonight, of the experience of reading them and seeing how much anger is directed at God, and psalms of lament and crying out for justice and experiencing sorrow. I think I, and probably many people, can learn a lot from that type of expression of anger with God. What if we imagined the divine as something that could carry and hold our anger? The divine is big enough and strong and supple enough to hold that rage that we carry too.
Jonathan Slocum.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm from Third Haven Meeting, which happens to be in the same county where Frederick Douglass was born in slavery. At first, when you were speaking of anger, I had a similar reaction to Carter, although I don't have his dramatic past. But I began to realize that really what you were saying was use the anger as a source of energy, but even more as a source of discernment. And that really touched me. That came through and erased my concern about feeling it. And you know, you need to test your leadings. You need to test whether the discernment is accurate. So it's not like you feel anger and you just act upon it. But I thought that was really powerful in a talk that I must say, Naomi, was filled with a lot of provocative ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you too. I appreciate that.
Steve Olszewski.
Hi, Naomi. Thanks again for a great presentation. I really got a lot out of this. And my thoughts are getting a better appreciation about anger and the need to find a way to express it. And what I'm getting out of our session tonight is that there's a need to both share that and find a way of expressing it as spirit energy, which I think is really healthy. Or another way I think about it is by using it to develop strength to take a stand. So I like all of that. But for those that want to express their anger physically or violently, do you have any tips for us on how to work with that?
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by violently? You're talking about harm to other people, or what?
Sure. So we see a lot of that in the world today. If we watch any of the news any night this week, we would see some violence in Portland where people are destroying property or people are angry at the police and throwing things at them, things like that. So I think you're advocating for channeling that anger in a peaceful way. But when you come across people that are channeling that anger physically and violently, that in a way that could cause harm to others, any tips on handling that?
Thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that, Steve. I'm actually not advocating for expressing anger peacefully, even though I understand where that push comes from. I think peace, like anger, has a lot of pieces to it, and I notice in Portland and across the world that there are expectations for how people should respond to systematic violence and oppression. And I believe that anger is important, and expressing that in whatever way is possible is part of what it means to care about community and to care about liberation. So when I'm advocating for anger, I am completely in favor of property destruction, to be quite frank, because of the larger systemic violence. These smaller instances of protesting are a very different kind of violence than the kind that dehumanizes and murders people. So from my perspective, there are ways to express anger peacefully, and sometimes expressions of anger call for destruction. Although I would not advocate for, say, killing somebody, but I think that there are ways to do things. There are ways to approach destruction as an indication of the importance of liberation.
So with every action deserves a reaction, is that kind of it? So the systemic violence requires a reaction of anger and violence back?
I'm not sure I'd say it requires, but it is understandable to see the reaction of anger and violence in response. And from my perspective as a white person, as a white woman engaged in this type of work, I can absolutely understand and support that kind of activism, even if it complicates my understanding of peace and anger. I put those aside for the moment and say, at this moment, it is most important to follow the leadership of Black activists, and to put aside my personal qualms. Definitely to consider and be thoughtful about how I'm engaging, but to recognize that the position that I'm coming from is one where I have never felt the kind of stress and trauma that these people have suffered. And so who am I to judge what kind of activism they need to express in the streets? And how can I best support that? And I think we see that historically too, that I think in this moment, there's a fretting of, say, that the Civil Rights Act was passed only after many, many days of what we call violent riots. And I think that's something that I'm learning more and more about each day. And I'm so grateful for the teachers who are teaching me. And I don't have a full answer for you, but I'm still thinking about it.
Good. Thank you for that.
Rita Varley.
Jonathan, if I may interject, I apologize, but we are running out of time. And so I know we have a series of hands. I apologize that I have to interject at this point. We have to wrap up and allow Naomi to get back to her night. So if I may close up for this evening.
Please, TJ, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Naomi, so very much for this keynote. It has stirred up more emotions and thoughts and feelings in me than I very much expected. And for the conversation that has continued. I will not say started, because this conversation has preceded us by millennia, that is continuing for us. I encourage friends to take this conversation back to your communities and your meetings and your families to keep it going. And I'll also invite folks to join us in a group photo to hold this moment with us in another visual. So if folks are not interested in being in a picture, you can turn off your cameras at this point. If you would like to, and your camera has been off, please turn it on at this point. And Shelley will be aiding us in some screenshots. Shelley.
Yes. Could everyone please hold your smile for a few seconds? Because we have 4 windows right now, and I will say we're okay, and then we'll be all set. I'm gonna mute myself while I take the photo.
There's 5 windows.
Please for 5 seconds and more. We're good. Thank you.
Do you have other announcements, TJ?
Yes, Jonathan, thank you. Thank you, Shelley. I also want to thank our captioner this evening for capturing our conversation as we went along. A reminder for folks to submit any announcements that they would like to be shared, as well as epistle committee submissions to sessions@pym.org. We also have a quarter book up on the website. So if you go to the annual session site, you will find the quarter book there. If folks would like to sign that they've been present and here, and so we can hold that. Additionally, the second Friendly Bible Hour that Christopher Moore is hosting will be tomorrow from 1 to 2 p.m. Look for the link in tonight's memos. And we will be having meeting for business from 2 to 3:30 right after that. Also tomorrow night, there will be a parent and caregiver worship sharing from 9 to 10 p.m. that is hosted by Young Adult Friends for YAF and youth program families. that is being co-facilitated by Melinda Wenner-Bradley and Meg Rose. So you can connect with either of them if you have not had the opportunity to register already. And with that, I want to thank you all again for joining us and for being here. Thank you again, Naomi, and have a pleasant evening.
And I might add that the epistle committee is hard at work drafting an epistle for the yearly meeting. And if you have anything you think they should consider to include in it, you can send that to submissions@pym.org so that they can add that to the epistle within their judgment, of course. And Naomi, thank you so very much for this inspiring and historically accurate keynote address. So we're very much in your debt for you having come and given us this.
Thank you too. Thank you all for listening and sharing this
And
space.
so we'll close with a couple minutes of silence. Thank you, everybody. Good night. We'll see you tomorrow.